Introduction to Daniel, Part 3. Daily provisions. Babylon was a highly religious society with continual animal sacrifice and rituals. Since the king was also a religious leader, the food from his table would have been sacrificed to the Babylonian pantheon. The food provided to Daniel and his friends was part of the king's very own diet. To reject the food outright would be an act of rebellion. Daniel and his friends needed to be very careful how they approached the subject. 3 years. The training Daniel and his friends was to receive would be a 3-year training program, after which they would be tested by the king himself. The educators knew their lives were on the line for their students. If their students looked bad, they could die. Life was cheap. Life was a cheap commodity in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was also known for his harshness. In 586 BC, King Zedekiah, the youngest son of Josiah, tried to escape from the Babylonian siege at night. When he and his sons were caught, they saw the cruel actions of Nebuchadnezzar, who blinded Zedekiah after he witnessed the murder of his sons. Jeremiah 39:5. Nebuchadnezzar was also known for burning people alive, as we see in Daniel chapter 3. Therefore, his officials were terrified at offending him, and more than likely told Daniel of the consequences of making him mad. The chief of the eunuchs. Daniel and his friends were under the control of Ashpenaz, and were more than likely eunuchs. The point they are renamed by Ashpenaz reinforces that they were under his direction and his responsibility. The wives and concubines of the king were part of the religious system of Babylon. Another part of the system was the temple prostitutes, whose Babylonian system found its way to Judah. The eunuchs, in part, were shielded from the corruption of the Babylonian system. We see the religious emphasis in Babylon by the names given to Daniel and his friends. The adoption of foreign names is not unique to Daniel. Joseph was given an Egyptian name by Pharaoh, and so was Moses, whose name means drawn in Egyptian. Living in the world causes us to make some concessions on what the world imposes. There are limits to the concessions a believer should make. Daniel and his friends demonstrate we can live in the world and still be true to our relationship with the Lord. Here's some Hebrew names. Daniel is God's judge, Belshazzar. Hananiah is God is gracious. Hananiah, Yah is gracious. Shadrach, Mishael, who is he? Who is he that is God? Me, Shael. What? Who is of God? Me, Shael. Yeah, is Meshach. Azariah is God has helped. Yah, Azariah, God has helped. Abednego. Daniel's heart. Daniel 1:8. Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you endanger my head before the king. Daniel proposed. In the first 8 verses, we see what separated Daniel from most of the people living in Jerusalem. He sought to please God, regardless of the circumstances. Try to imagine the perspective of this young man. He was taken to a foreign land, away from parents and family, forced to submit to a violent and pagan people, yet he had purpose. Daniel knew who he was and who God was. The Hebrew word masad, I'm not sure. Hebrew word masad literally means to put, to place, to point. Matzav, it could be, yeah, matzav, matzeva. Literally means to put, to place, or to point. Daniel knew the direction he needed to God, and he set course to accomplish his purpose. His heart. Here, the Hebrew word is lev, and means inner man, mind, or will. Daniel, at an early age, learned the secret of spiritual success: to be real with God, to trust God, and to be obedient. Solomon learned this principle also. At the end of his life, Daniel learned at the start of his. Solomon, who was the wisest man in the world, fell because of his flesh. He was not willing to purpose his heart. For this reason, he lived a compromised life with sin. Nehemiah 13:6. God could use Daniel because Daniel wanted to be used and made himself available by being sincere. And further, my son, be admonished by these, of making many books, there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Ecclesiastes 12:12-14. Defile himself. Daniel knew the provisions from the king's table were sacrificed to idols, and by eating the meat, he would be defiled. The meat more than likely includes foods violating the Mosaic law, in addition to being sacrificed to the pantheon of Babylonian deities. Wine would also have had portions poured out as offerings and drink offerings. He requested. Daniel knew if God was willing, God would make a way. Daniel did not just wait for God to rescue him. He stepped forward in faith. He gave God the opportunity to work by asking for an exception. Daniel had faith in God's ability, and because Daniel was willing to trust God, God could use Daniel. Peter was instructed to put his foot out of the boat on the water. He only began to sink when he lost faith. Matthew 14:28-30. God brought favor. Daniel stepped forward in faith and allowing God work in his life. Ashpenaz was a high official who answered directly to the king. Nebuchadnezzar terrified him. He knew what he was capable of doing. Throughout Scripture, we see the same principle applied in the success of other Bible heroes of faith. Abel, Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, David. Daniel's test. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables and eat, and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men will eat the portion of the king's delicacies, as you see fit to deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter, and tested them 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in the flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. To the steward, the chief of the eunuchs, and even though Daniel found favor with him, was still terrified of Nebuchadnezzar and resisted Daniel's request. Most people at this point would resign themselves to fate. Daniel had purpose in his heart and was not going to let the fear of the highest ranking person right under the king stop him. He went to the steward, the guardian, appointed by Ashpenaz, and asked him, and he consented. God tests the sincerity of our hearts by allowing obstacles. We trust God. We give him the opportunity to work in our lives. For example, if you have the desire to serve God on the mission field and can't raise support, or the doors are closed, how do you respond? Do you give God the opportunity to work, or do you shut the door and give up? Do you start learning the language, making preparations despite the current circumstances? Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself, and he is going to give God every opportunity to reward his faith. Test your servants. Daniel made a deal with the steward in charge of him. If he didn't look good after 10 days, then he would relent. The 10 days gave Daniel and his friends time to have God intervene on their behalf. Daniel's back was to the wall, and by asking for a test, Daniel found favor with the steward. He let the steward benefit from his faith. The world around us benefits from our trials. But when they see God reward our faith, God gets the glory. Here, the steward saw God at work. Vegetables and water. The word for vegetables here is zeroah, meaning vegetables from sown seed. Translated pulse in the King James Version. Daniel was more concerned with righteousness than his comforts. He was willing to live on a meager diet to be righteous and indulge himself in sin, even though he had every excuse to do so. He consented. The steward agreed to Daniel's test, and he saw God work. Daniel looked better, not because of the food, but because of faith. God gave Daniel favor because Daniel was willing to be used by God. Another principle we can learn from Daniel is if we are willing to be used by God, God will use us. Daniel was contagious, not only to his 3 friends, but to all those around him who saw his faith in action. By the time we get to chapter 4, we see the most powerful man in the world confessing the God of Daniel as his God. God rewards Daniel and his friends. Daniel 1:17. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Daniel 1:18. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom, understanding, about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. God gave them. First, we see these 4 teenagers willing to give up the best food in Babylon for vegetables and water. They are rewarded with a better appearance and favor before those in charge of them. However, this was only a trial run for them. Their step forward allowed God to reward them. They learned their hope and trust was in God alone. God blessed them with his wisdom. Though they knew the wisdom of Babylon, it was foolishness to them. For this reason, the wisdom from God's Spirit was brighter than any wisdom that can be offered in Babylon. The principle of God's wisdom is available today for all who see it. The wisdom of the world is foolishness to God. God used 4 teenage slaves who trusted in God to be his testimony to a pagan world. God uses weakness for his glory. God does not need human strength to accomplish his purpose. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Psalm 19:7. The entrance of your words gives light, gives understanding to the simple. Psalm 119:30. But God has chosen the foolish things of this world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised, God has chosen, and the things which are not to bring to nothing the things that are. 1 Corinthians 1:27-28. The 4 teenage boys were given a supernatural understanding by God, not for their glory, for God's glory. God was able to use them as an example to encourage those who would follow in generations to come how to live a successful spiritual life. Daniel began his ministry in 605 BC. As a hostage to the battle, he continued until 536 BC.